Let me start with Astrid and ask her a question. Could you just help us understand how municipal cities issue taxation? What's the formula? What's the design? What is feasible, not feasible? In cities, you have rich people and then not so rich people. You can't have standardized all of even taxation. Taxation is one way of actually helping empower communities or discriminate. Over to you, Astrid.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jalal. Thanks to FES. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. And as many of you who I know in this room know, discuss the thing that I'm most passionate about is where is the money going to come from, as Kuria very bluntly asked me during the break. So, part of the money, as Jalal, as you mentioned, has to come from the cities themselves. But what the cities can do is very dependent on what legislation says. And legislation can be very different across different countries. And, we've already touched upon in pretty much all the panels where our cities have legacies, institutional legacies, historical legacies, colonial legacies. And a lot of what cities can do today is still actually hangovers from times of what the colonial structures put forward to them. And so, for example, in a lot of cities that are Anglophone cities, like my own Kampala, they technically, in theory, have a lot more powers. And then in a lot more cities that were former French colonies, it's much more of a centralized structure. But I also think we have to expand this question a little bit further, because we talk a lot, and I'm asked a lot in the work I do about how do we tax people? Where do we get the money? And it just reminds me of Francis's statistic this morning about how 70% of people go like, well, I actually don't want to pay the money, right? And then you have this chicken and egg problem. You need the money to finance services, but you don't, provide the services. And so I think what we need to open this conversation on taxes, and especially if we're talking about just cities, is we need to match taxes to expenditure. And we do not talk about expenditure enough. We do not, cities want to raise revenue, but raising revenue is intimately tied to how you spend that revenue and what people see their revenue being used for. And that's what we call the social contract. And in a lot of our cities, the social contract is broken. Just a very quick anecdote. When I was going to, Uganda has very, very few taxpayers per capita. And I was one of them when I was living in Kampala. And I went to pay my taxes as I did. And the bank teller, when I was issuing my form, he laughed at me and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm paying my taxes." He said, "You're one of the only ones. I don't even know how to use the revenue system to issue taxes." And then he said, at the end, when I finally finished paying my taxes, he's like, "This is what is financing the Speaker of Parliament's new car." And I think that to me just encapsulates the social contract problem we have, right? The reason people don't want to pay is because they don't see what they're getting as goods. So I think all conversations around taxes have to be intimately tied to expenditure as well, because that is what the social contract is looking at.
Jeremy.
Thank you, Jalal. Should I continue the conversation?
Yes.
Thank you, Jalal, and of course, thank you, Astrid, for kicking off this discussion. I'd like to segue into the points you've framed very well together with David. Where does the money come from, and why that's a foundational question when we talk about urban infrastructure and building just cities? And that is because money, money is not neutral. Money comes with the particular norms. Money, or rather the financial system, let me start there, is a normative system that will enroll whatever ecosystem that it is interacting with in its specific ideas, how cities should be organized, how urban infrastructure should be run, etc. And so when we talk about where the money should come from, and we are, of course, acknowledging the financing crisis we currently have in a lot of African countries where governments are running out of money, and we need to arguably turn to the capital markets, to the private sector. We should ask ourselves the question, what changes when we shift from public financing of infrastructure on the basis of taxation, and we shift towards the private markets, or rather specifically the financial markets, providing the finance for urban infrastructure development. And what the intervention, or rather the contribution I would like to make as we continue this discussion, is that the public funding that comes with the taxation as the source is legitimated by particular requirements that the citizens have towards their governments. And that, of course, includes equity, equality, all these Just City Working Group principles that we have discussed today. We should then ask ourselves the other question: what happens then when we now can no longer depend on taxation? For example, in Kenya, where the citizens are saying we have been overtaxed, we don't want any more taxes, and we therefore turn to capital markets by floating bonds, for example, then we need to look closely, and I'll be happy to speak to this subsequently. We need to look closely at how new actors and new interests are then enrolled into this construction of the city. The private investors who are lending money to the government and therefore expect the government to now act in a way that keeps the investors satisfied that indeed their investment in the government is being preserved and will yield profit. And of course, that is very different from when we use taxes to finance government. I'm happy to continue expounding on this after.
Thank you, Jeremy. To just manage time, I will just allow one question, two of you answer. So I'll just to say one. So I ask, and I come to another question. You know how cities are funded, are either their own source of revenue, loans, grants, or through borrowing, or what you call national transfers. Yes. But lately, the whole idea of accessing capital market has become very, very full of, permanent, yes. So, but there has been an issue called public-private partnership. It was an instrument to finance urban infrastructure requirement. Let me ask our friend from Nakuru to just give us some experience on using PPP.
Thank you, Jalal. I think I want to look at this from the two different areas. The issues of the financing, particularly municipal financing, and the issues of municipal funding, so that we get where we are headed to. Now, when we look at the issues of financing, and again, we can break down into three components. That is the own system, that we are very traditional, the own source revenue that every municipality then is supposed to generate. And there is a limit that can do when you look at the infrastructure. And this is coming in very timely because right now I'm in the process of developing a 5-year housing investment program for the county government of Nakuru. And again, that's why the first thing I asked is, where is the money? Because it's a big talk, and we can come with, $100-200 million investment program, very comprehensive. And then where is the money? Real money. So looking at the own source level, that can only meet most of our obligations in terms of money, not really infrastructure. And that's the experience I've had with the city of Nakuru and other municipalities that I'm coordinating within Nakuru. But even the own source level may be not enough in terms of the staffing and all that. Then there is the public funding. Okay. Our municipalities are almost entirely dependent on public funding. The national government, whether they are debt, whether they are grant modeling, with the support of UN, World Bank, and others. And that sustained a big component of the infrastructure in our urban centers, whether you're talking about housing, roads, drainage, water, sanitation, all those aspects of infrastructure. And then there is the next component that has been very difficult, that's the private finance. So we talk about very interesting debates on municipal boards, green boards, PPPs, and I can tell you in Kenya, the last 20 years, we have been talking PPP without a single program of PPP in place. It's a big debate. And we are not sure there is money, could be there, but also then how do we access it? So there has been framework of PPP at small scale. But then when we are talking about the needs of urbanization in our cities, and especially in Kenya and sub-Saharan region, and we really need to rethink, can we afford these mini interventions? One of my mentors called it the mini-skirt interventions, Is it the direction we need to go? And so that calls for serious rethinking in terms of now the funding mechanisms and the funding modeling. Well, last PPP offers big hope. It's potentially a big agenda elsewhere. Then we need to look at the traditional where we are coming from and look at the issues of the just systems that we want to put in place. Okay? Then we should then start asking ourselves, how then, because the biggest component has been the trust issue that comes with the entire investment program. And I think that will also be an issue of our discussion. How do we create that trust? That PPP then becomes an effective model for national government and even the municipal level system. So far, I think the only case we have seen is more of, I wouldn't even call it a PPP, it's more of a JV, joint venture, which is a pseudo PPP sort of, in the housing sector. Some few units, 500 at national level, where government collaborates with the private sector, local and international, to put up 1,000, 2,000 units under JV. Now we are still weighing the success story of that. Okay. Now JV model is a very interesting model in terms of infrastructure improvement or undertaking infrastructure work. In terms of housing, it makes a lot of it's a bit easier and makes it a lot of sense. We are doing 1,000 units, bring your money, take 80% of that. Those are 800 units, you can dispose them to the market. Then we are left with the 200 as a state. That looks doable. What about a road? You do this road, take 80% of your road, then what do you do? Okay? Or you say you put toll stations, and the citizen says no. So who enforces that? There are things the private sector will now look at it and say, I don't think I'm safe in this investment. So I think there are those general debate as we go on in terms of financing and also the funding component.
Thank you. That's great.
So I really appreciate your intervention. As I was saying to Kuria over the break, I have to caveat and humble myself that my interventions come from the perspective of all I have to do is actually advise. He actually has to implement. So take whatever I say with a grain of salt. But I do think you mentioned some very critical pieces. So where is the money? I think really is the focus of this conversation. And I would argue that the money is there in the capital markets, right? And there is analysis that is out there that there's money looking for projects. The problem is it's not finding these projects, right? So we have a mismatch between demand and supply. But I think especially now that we're talking about just city, and this may seem counterintuitive, but we do have to talk about cities reaching out to capital markets of money. But the infrastructure investments we're also talking about are not just for us today, but they're for many generations to come if they're built well. If you're just using tax money from today to pay for those infrastructure investments, then our future generations are very happily benefiting from what we've invested in, right? But it's actually, if you can borrow money and repay it over time, it brings a sense of intergenerational justice in terms of we are all contributing to the investment that we have made. And this is where I think capital markets play a big role, right? It allows cities to take on the upfront money that they need now to make the investment in infrastructure, but to very correctly, and I'm glad that you made the distinction between financing and funding, to be able to allocate that funding over time, over generations, as they repay that debt, right? and create that accountability cycle to many generations to come, because those generations, their taxes are also repaying that infrastructure. So you're creating intergenerational justice. And so I think accessing capital markets, which cities in Africa, outside from South Africa, have struggled to do, is really important. I think, Jalal, you asked a question to PPPs that I want to just touch upon, and then I think Jeremy, I think you can pull on this much more from your expertise. So PPPs came in vogue about 10 years ago. It was thrown around like this is the silver bullet solution to all our financing problems. It is not. First of all, there are no silver bullet solutions. Financing of cities, like everything else, is going to be a complex amalgamation of very many instruments, including maybe PPPs, but they have to be matched to the right projects. And here's where we make the mistake. Too often when I work with cities, I go into the city and they say, this is the project and it will be financed by a PPP. That's actually not the way to go about it. You say, this is the project. I am now going to evaluate all the different ways it can be financed. And I'm going to pick the way that represents the best value for money. It may be PPP, it may be financing on my own balance book, right? But the minute you say this project is going to be financed by PPP, that project is likely going to fail because you have not put in any of the due diligence mechanisms to even make sure that PPP is viable. And so we really, and this is to your point, again, South Africa is really the only place on the African continent that has managed to do municipal PPPs so far, right? And that's because they're difficult to do. Even the place where the PPP originated, which is the UK, they don't even like PPPs anymore, right? Because they found that you can have cost overruns, you can have different pieces, but you can do PPPs right. It just requires a lot of work. And we don't like to put in that work because we like to think there's silver bullet solutions. Finally, one thing I'll say, just because I really want to bring it back to the Just City, when you do a PPP, it's going to have to repay itself somehow, right? It's going to need to generate revenue. That's fine, right? But how is it going to generate revenue? Usually user fees. Again, that's fine. But what you then need to make sure, if you're doing a PPP, for example, that is for a public good that people should have access to, for example, water, you need to make sure people are not excluded as a result of the fact that it's a PPP. So as a government, part of your obligation is to put into place some sort of social safety net or otherwise to ensure that marginalized groups still have access to that service. And sometimes we forget this, right? We say, okay, the private sector is now running and operating this, and the private sector, fair enough, needs to make back its return on the PPP. But you still have an obligation as a government because it is still a public good and it's still a public service and people need to access it, right? So my point is, we like to believe it's easy. We like to believe it's a silver bullet solution. We like to say, this is going to be financed by a PPP, but it's not. It's really complex to get right. And only some projects are actually suited to being procured and financed as a PPP.
Thank you. Let's hear from Jeremy. PPP is managing public interest and private interest. The ratio of ethics, regulation, profitability, in an environment you don't have well-established institutions in Africa. I used to work in the World Bank. I know the PPP, when they created that tool, it was messy. Let me hear from you, since you are professor teaching law, let us hear from legal point of view on managing PPPs.
Thank you, Jalal, and of course, Astrid and David, for your interesting comments on PPPs. Indeed, PPPs have been touted as an important intervention in the sense that they should, for example, mobilize more private sector financing by virtue of government and the private sector coming together, that there will be technology transfer of expertise from the private to the public sector, etc. Now, whether or not PPPs work depends on a couple of issues, of course, including the fact that we need strong institutions, including legal institutions. And Kenya is one of the countries that have taken PPPs seriously over the last 10 or so years, has also established a very detailed policy, legal and regulatory framework for PPPs. But whether or not these legal frameworks work, again, depends on context. And this is where the rubber hits the road. There is one project that was undertaken, I believe, in the Coast province. I've forgotten the name of the project, on a PPP basis. And of course, when you read the legal framework, it says PPPs should promote public participation, freedom of information, etc. So the community that this PPP project was adjacent to was actually adversely affected by this project. And so they decided to exercise their constitutional right to information by requesting for information relating to this project, its financing, etc. And this is where we then see the power of private finance rearing its head. The project basically refused to give this information to the citizens and argued that this is actually a commercial project. And because of that, we have commercial interests to protect. And that is an example of where, despite having good legal frameworks, you see that certain systems, and here I can call them financial commercial systems, come with very powerful norms and practices that overpower even the public, or rather the public law frameworks put in place to promote this just city working group principles such as participation. And they went to a tribunal that still ruled against their favor, that indeed they do not have the right to get this information because this is a commercial project. So this shows us that we need to do more than just, for example, establishing legal frameworks. The question is, how are these legal frameworks being operationalized and implemented if the actors within this particular ecosystem do not get it right, or in terms of the perspective of this project as a public-driven project or a private sector commercial project that needs to deliver profits to the private part of this PPP. So law is not enough. We need to do more than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. If you listen for the last two questions, there are 4 or 5 key terms I listened. Astrid said social contract. Kuria said trust. Jeremy said transparency. This has to do, nothing to do about finance, anything. So now, how do you ensure that investment in urban infrastructure promotes social justice, provides equity, whatever, or also design in a participatory way and effective use? Start with you.
Thank you. I think in the last presentation, I made a comment, and I would want to get back to that, yes, we are talking about just city, just systems, and now here we should be talking about just financing, just funding. Because the result of it then gives us the baby of just city. Now, we need to see how this debate gets into or moves to from the just principles again to the just instruments. Because if we don't get the instrument right in terms of this funding modeling, then it will affect the marginalized even more. So if you're looking at social inclusion in our cities and how to integrate that and make it even easier for the informal settlements, the slums, and a lot of our dwellers, then any instrument that comes in place to hurt them will even exclude them more. We either get them out of the city or marginalize them in formal settlements in a long term. Now, few areas that we need to rethink the instrument is the issue of the user charges, the user fee. Because that's, if you look at any municipality and you talk about tax, that's the easiest thing, user fee. It's easier to enforce because then the demands are there. If I have a car and I need to park in the city, I have no other choice. So I'll still pay. If you want water, you still have to pay. Access to sanitation, you still have to pay. Titus, and don't say I started. Yeah, so it's the easiest to enforce. So if we don't get the right instrument for that component, then the issue of just citizen, within our city spectrum becomes again, long matter. The issue of collective, I heard about collective funding, which is really thinkable, or, something that we really need to see. How do we develop the right tools? If they are there, how do we adopt these right tools? If it has worked elsewhere, most likely it requires some, few modifications here to work in our cases. The beauty is if you ask the city manager of my city, he definitely knows how many matatu and, those border and, all those circles. Maybe he has a whole range of, 50 to almost 100 circles. They are within the associations. How do we utilize that in terms of this framework of funding? So that's another big potential. But in our cases, you find most of these agencies or the circles are there for their own good, organizing. Yeah, to us in the city, it's about discipline. They can now do self-discipline. But we have not tapped to these circles as a potential funding option. And I think almost all spectrum, whether it's housing, transport, we have all these agencies at local level. For them to be part of this system, for them to feel part of the just development that we are talking about. We are exploring, I know it might be very early stage, but we are exploring the issue of blood banking, in our city. Again, it's not a very easy work. We have had it elsewhere, it backfired, but we strongly feel if it's well, again, with the right instrument, then we have a big opportunity for blood banking as a catalyst for, even the PPPs and the JVs. Air rights, the president of my association is here. They have of late succeeded in getting the apartments, title deeds, sectional ownership, which is a very good thing. I think some few years and now we are most likely going to make a lot of progress where we are not going horizontal. We just decided let's go vertical and buy it. And we explored issues of airlines, which is a big potential for municipalities and cities to make income and free our cities still. As we go up, then what happens to the horizontal? Can we get compensation? The same thing like carbon credit. Okay? And there are several value capture. I think we started that within the city of Nakuru some few weeks ago. It's causing a lot of crisis. The valuation law that is already ongoing. We are testing it for the whole of last month and this month, but politically it's a very emotive issue because then we are trying to say, can we set up new valuation standard of your area? And I can tell you the citizen would want status as much as possible. Asset boards, I've not seen that working very easily. But again, these are areas that we have big opportunity with the right instruments so that then the value for money become easy as we discuss on our assets. Because what has happened in the last part of the government has been the issue of privatization of our assets. But who determines the price? Is it the just price for the citizen when we are privatized? So again, it boils back to the agencies, whether they are national government, the African Union Commission, the UN, the World Bank, to start helping us to structure just instrument. That way then we will end up achieving longer term just solution for our cities.
Thank you.
So I think my biggest takeaway from this session today is that we have a lot to learn from Nakuru because you're doing the things that many, many cities wish they could be doing. So I'm very, very excited to come and visit that. But given I've just said that, then I have to quote the city manager from before because he said, what successful infrastructure is infrastructure that's built with people in mind. And I think that's very clear. And as I was saying before, infrastructure is a long-term investment. If it's built with the people in mind, it's not just the people today, it's your children, it's your grandchildren, it's all the future generations to come. So that Vision 2050 that you were talking about creates that intergenerational thinking around infrastructure, which I think is really key when you think about, okay, what's the infrastructure that's going to work? What's the just infrastructure? I think similarly, and maybe this is a concept that is less explored, we need to think about financing with people in mind. And this kind of goes to your point about the instruments, right? I think we think about finance disconnected sometimes from the infrastructure. We think about, okay, we need to raise the money. But actually, the raising the money is for what? It's for that infrastructure. It's for that long vision. And Charles mentioned in his opening remarks, we shouldn't always talk about the challenges, we should talk about the opportunities. And one major opportunity that Africa has with its urbanization process, right? Whilst we're urbanizing in a very resource and climate constrained environment, we are urbanizing in the most data-rich environment that we have ever had before in the world, right? So how do we use that data to be able to figure out things about how we can create that infrastructure that is needed? And I think that goes a little bit to the previous panel that talked about stakeholder consultations. But here I want to caution, I see stakeholder consultations sometimes being misused, right? So I see people coming in and gathering people in a room like this saying, hey, what infrastructure would you like? Okay, let's put this all down on a flip chart. And then maybe a few months, a year or two later, coming back and saying, can we validate this? Okay, we've had one woman in the room, we've had one PWD in the room, we've had one this. Okay, we have everyone's views. That's not how you do stakeholder consultation, particularly with something that is as big and involved with a lot of money as infrastructure is. I also think we have to look at data critically, right? So we did a project a couple of years ago with Kampala Capital City Authority, where they were trying to understand, with limited resources, which are the roads that we should widen first, right? Which are the ones causing most congestion? Which are the ones that are going to create the biggest impact? So at that time, a couple of years ago, we actually had access to mobile phone data. And mobile phone data is great in some ways because when people move, it triangulates, right? So it gets 3 pings, so you can see how people are moving. You can actually map congestion. But what we did in line with that is we did surveys. And what did we find with the surveys? Well, if we just use mobile phone data and we chose which roads to widen there, we'd miss a whole lot of people. Which people? Well, mostly women in the informal sector, because guess what? They don't move, right? They usually are selling from towards their household because they have childcare responsibilities. And if they're not moving, they're not caught by mobile phone data, right? So whilst we are urbanizing in a data-rich environment, and I think data is an incredibly important input into this financing of just infrastructure questions, we also always have to critically evaluate what are the views that we're hearing, what are the views that we're not hearing, and how can we get those views on the table, both in terms of the stakeholder consultations, but also in terms of the data we can collect. And that collective evidence base, I think, can help policymakers like Kuria and Gatau when they actually have to make the decision. Because unfortunately, we have to prioritize. We can't get past that fact. There's limited resources. So how do we prioritize? Well, we have to figure out what works for the majority rather than the minority if we want just cities to work.
I just link it to the last sentence you said. The question is about prioritization. How do communities, cities decide on prioritization? I mean, there's all kind of top-down, bottom-up, horizontal, vertical, expert-driven, or consensus-driven. Anyway, what's the experience? What do we know about good practice of prioritization, urban infrastructure?
Thank you for that, Jalal. I think, first of all, we will have to admit something that I don't know whether it's you, David mentioned it in the morning, that there is a tension between political influences and city planning, for example. And so prioritization ends up becoming a political issue for governments in the sense that they have to balance many different constituencies' interests. One of the ways in which we can come out on the other end better off in terms of prioritization is that we, or rather the state, whether it is the municipal level government or the national government, should not cede its role in urban infrastructure development, in the development of just cities, to the private sector, because the private sector can only represent a very narrow set of interests compared to the government, that represents much wider constituencies. And of course, prioritization is all about which interests do we place first. So the state needs to continue playing this big role in determining, even whether we're talking about PPPs and other private sector-led projects, it should be able to represent the wider interests of the citizens. Secondly, the good thing with the state-led frameworks is that we also have requirements for example, impact assessments that are legitimated or rather that are required by law. And again, impact assessments help us in determining, again, what the cost-benefit analysis of particular projects without necessarily focusing on value for money, profit, but looking at much wider issues relating to human rights, etc. The reason why the state needs to be involved in prioritization too is because once the state exits the scene, there is a recalibration of the relationship between the citizens and the city, and that is because there is no longer a right holder and a duty bearer. So that's why it's important for the state to remain involved. Secondly, in terms of also looking at how we can come out the other end with the optimal priorities, we need to involve communities in decision-making in urban infrastructure developments. This engagement should not just be during the public participation phase, whereby they are asked, what do you want? And then we retreat to the boardroom and we make decisions there. Community interests should be reflected in the conceptualization, development, governance, and operationalization of city infrastructure projects on a daily basis. An example could be their representation in the boards of municipalities, the boards of, for example, Kenya's Affordable Housing Program, which has a board running that, the PPP committee in Kenya. All these institutions need to have community representation, so as, again, to be able to balance the interests when it comes to prioritization of what needs to be built, where, for whom, how, and at what cost. Third, there is a role that law can still play in also fostering equitable prioritization, if we can think of such a concept. And I'll give the example of Kenya, where in the last 2 years, we've had quite a number of public interest litigation cases filed in court to essentially nudge the government to the right path when the government has, for example, refused to do public participation, and then someone sues and gets the government back on the table to ensure that it takes on board the interests of the community. The government then comes and does public participation, but then retreats to the boardroom, and of course, narrow parochial interests determine what policy prevails, and then we run to court again, and we tell the court, actually, this public participation was not real public participation. They need to explain themselves as to how they weighed the different interests. And so at the moment, we've had quite good legal jurisprudence, if I can use that term, that has supported community engagement in very granular forms, in the sense that now the government is required to explain that, yes, you did public participation, but how did you actually weigh the different interests that were placed on the table? And so that is an example, again, of how public interest litigation, advocacy using the law can be used to ensure that at any one time prioritization is indeed balancing the interests of communities in ways that help us to build the just cities.
I think that's a very interesting debate when it comes to issues of public participation in terms of infrastructure. I'm not sure we get it right most of the time, but looking at it, because when we have done, and I think with the new constitution, we are pushed to that angle, and there has been a lot of clamoring for public participation. But I think we need to see, and especially at infrastructure level, at what point can we extend this issue of public participation? Now, for instance, public participation works very well, and that's the culture we are finding out in Kenya, and I'm sure I don't know about the other countries, that we are actually driven by economic planning in Kenya. So it becomes very easy saying, I have $10 million. How would you want us to spend this $10 million? That's how we have gotten it all along, all those years. Okay. The most important department right now, even at government level, is the National Treasury. Because then they decide they're putting you the ceiling or giving you the ceiling to what you will have to do. Okay? Not from what you want to do, then we budget it. It's actually, this is the money we are giving you to do what you have to do. Now, that becomes easy for public participation. Yeah? But then all the biggest mistakes and bladders we are having in our cities is purely starting with economic planning. Instead of us going back to the drawing board and say, do we have a spatial plan for our city? Because that's the starting point, not the money. What we want to do, that should be the starting point. When we have a comprehensive spatial plan for your city, then it identifies almost all those structural issues, those long generational programs. Then it becomes very easy to say, we have these 10 issues, let's put now the priority. But if I go there with a basket of money and tell the community, we have this amount of money, I want to hear your priorities. Number one is food. What's the first priority? Not roads. Yeah, I have no idea whether we can build any airport from public participation in Kenya. It's not doable. So if you have to do an airport, you have to do an airport as a government. Yeah, or get a PPP. But not through public participation, where people will come and say, our top number one priority for the city of Nakuru is we want an airport. You know, it's not workable. So, but again, the failure is the whole system that we are planning after we have the money. We have this $1 million plan for it. Instead of saying, where do we need to start? We have this trunk road that will cost $100 million. How much do you have treasury? They'll give you 10% of that. Then you start the journey. And that's why the next generations can see the long-term 2050 plan and agree, yes, we will repay. We are part of that repayment, yeah, for that long-term generational program. Failure to that, again, we go back to the mini-start interventions. Oh, there's a bridge there, we just fix the bridge. We don't have enough money for the structural issues. So we end up addressing the symptoms that are coming up and down. Just to close on that, I think our experience, I've worked with the manager for the last now almost 4 years. And with the support of FES, we did a pilot in terms of the NMT in Nakuru City. And it brought a lot of issues. I think he was almost going to court. He was being taken to court. You know, you're disrupting our systems. We want more parking spaces. Who told you we want walking spaces in the city? We want more parking. And it was a big issue. Today, that's 4 years later, all the roads are now almost becoming a law in Nakuru that you must put NMT. Yeah? From just a small, less than 1 kilometer pilot. So if again we had started from the public participation, we wouldn't be there. So we had to do it almost getting someone to jail because of thinking transformatively. But then now people start saying, is this what you wanted? Really, this is a good idea. Now for every budgeting we are doing for any single road within the city and the municipality, they are insisting we want that walking space now. They are even saying, I think in one of the meeting I had in one of the informal settlements where we only have 6 meter wide space for access, and we told them, what do we do? And they say, divide by 2. Give 3 meters to the vehicles, give 3 meters to us. And that's what we have done. Yeah, but it's because they have already seen a practical working case of a pilot that works. Okay.
Can I just add a quick comment? So I think we're also talking, sometimes with cities, we talk about public participation in terms of to the community, which is clear and we should do that, absolutely. But I think with a lot of the cities that I work with, and caveat if that's not Nakuru, so maybe you're doing all of this, we forget that as cities, as local governments, we also have to communicate upwards. And you mentioned, for example, the Ministry of Finance. A lot of the times I work with cities who have great plans and, you know, even financing options, someone coming to do the finance, and guess who says no? Well, it's actually the Ministry of Finance who legislatively is allowed to say no. So we need to do that I don't want to call it public participation, but we need to do that participation, that consultation upwards as well. And then even more than that, right now, again, I want to come back to this question because I think it's super fundamental. Where is the money? There is so much money right now in climate finance, right? The climate finance system, as it works right now, does not come to cities, right? It does not come to Africa and it does not come to cities, right? So about 3%, I think, comes to Africa, mostly to 4 countries, one of which is Kenya, by the way. But then below cities, the global system for climate finance is not meant to come to cities. Yet, who faces the impact of climate change? Where does the rubber hit the road to pick it's with you guys. You're the ones who are on a day-to-day basis, right? And so that communication also has to go upwards globally, right? We can't just always, but then sometimes I see that we do it too much. Like, for example, and I don't know whether this has changed, but I noticed the first panel tomorrow or the financing panel tomorrow, maybe this has changed because I only saw a draft version of the program. And there's all national government people on the panel, which is great that national government people are having this conversation. But if it's a conversation about financing cities, there should also be cities on the panel, right? And we need to have this cross conversation, not one conversation at national level, one conversation at city level, one conversation at community level, because then we're defeating the purpose of participation, right? That conversation needs to cut across.
Thank you. Here we have 2 perspectives. Community participation or engagement from like top down or bottom up. I think this public participation or engagement has been probably widely misused. What is the parliament? In a proper government democratic structure, you have elected the parliament. You have city council. Not only that, you have political parties competing on policy. And you're telling me you're bringing the mayor to engage with local council or local communities, listen to the community to prioritize. This is a very difficult situation. It is contextual. It has to be quality in it, Everything cannot be popular participation. Second, the biggest animal in the whole process is Ministry of Finance, in the budget. Already budget has been allocated, earmarked, sectorized for a city. You cannot change this. So you are working in a context where there is democratic process going, contesting political parties, parliamentarians, limited resources, the prioritization become very complex. But definitely communities you can hear. If you look at, I think we're bringing this American or European model superimposed. I live in the US. Well, I was involved in this. Is creating what you call allowing bullet train in California. 11 years, never happened. Because consultation happened with community, they cannot build their own. Anyway, I think we have to be very modest here. It has become contextual. Before I close and before opening for Q&A, I will have the last question. To what extent do you think the infrastructure investment creates jobs? Yes, they just, it's very important. Is it not only create jobs, that is create decent jobs? Sorry.
That's a big so it's almost like a consultation and public participation. Now, my experience the last 20 years in urban and to be realistic in this sector is that again, because of the financing protocol, the current protocol, then it becomes very difficult for us to go to the issues of job creation. Most of it is purely the private contractual system. You want to do roads, advertise it, get contractors, give them the few billions that's available, they deliver to you the roads or the bridges. Now, if you look at our laws, national laws on procurement, it doesn't give us any component that we can actually deal with in terms of job creation. That's the most unfortunate thing, because again, the biggest the biggest spender in any country is actually the government. So if the laws then do not comply to help you reach them, then it becomes a big challenge. Now, what we are trying to do again in Nakuru I think we are doing a lot of experiments. You can help us here because we need to get right to this experiment. Otherwise, then it will be a big disaster for the manager and his team. What we are trying to do is we have actually set aside 2 roads, that's about 3 kilometer, 1.5 kilometer in 2 settlements, where we are engaging and we are moving forward to finding how do we then contract to get into labor-intensive modeling, okay, of doing roads. So we have now purchased the carbon making machines as a government. We are training young people. We want them to produce and sell to us the cabros for road making. But more importantly is that we want them trained to build the road themselves. That way the entire procurement, apart from the machines that we have procured, the other almost 80% will go directly to them for labor and materials. But there will be no contractor in this pilot of 3 kilometers, that's 1 kilometer for the 2 sections, just to see, can it work? It might be more expensive, but you can imagine 80% of that funding getting to the pockets of the local people, the artisans who are there, the laborers and all that. Something that would have taken us with a contractor maybe 2 months, we are targeting to take about 8 months to complete because of that component of the labor intensive. We are not sure the results are, again, it's an experiment we are doing, but I think we need to do such bold moves that can then reflect and tell us, start questioning, do we need then to change the law on procurement?
I'm just going to take a quick detour because I want to comment on this thing about experimentation. So many of you asked me who know me before and who know I'm from Uganda asked me, why did you move to Hong Kong? And one of the reasons I moved to Hong Kong is because we often talk about, how did China do it? How did they manage to urbanize, industrialize, lift 800 million people out of poverty in 1 generation? And when we answer that question, we make it sound like it was like a straight line. And this is the playbook that you need to use. Like the amount of times I've heard Hong Kong being used as a best practice in workshops and everything, right? And I'm like, but nothing can be a straight line. Like policy is messy. And actually, one of the things that I'm finding out big time about what China did, right, which is, again, very counterintuitive because you think of China as this behemoth that is like this very state-led, is that China allowed experimentation, right? And actually, what China allowed was, it not only allowed, it incentivized experimentation. It said, please, everyone, and figure out what works in your community. So I think I just wanted to say that because I think the experimentation is key because what works in Nakuru may not work in Kampala, right? Because we're 2 very different places, very different communities. What may work in Nakawa and Kampala may not work in Rubaga and Kampala, right? So this experimentation and this localization is key. But to Jalal's question, can infrastructure create jobs? I think just infrastructure can. And what do I mean by just infrastructure? Well, I think infrastructure that creates livability of cities. So that creates quality, safe, affordable living spaces. And I'm not only talking about now the housing, but connection to services. That obviously is sustainable when we think about climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. But importantly, and here the economist in me shines through, so apologies, I am an economist by training, is infrastructure that is productive. And what do I mean about productive? Well, first of all, it needs to connect. It needs to connect people to jobs, but it also needs to create jobs. Yeah. And we are actually in a city right now which managed to put some of those principles into practice. The big urban housing program that they did here in Addis Ababa, where they built a lot of hundreds of thousands of units of public housing, didn't work perfectly, I agree. But one of the things that was super interesting about it, it wasn't just conceived of a public housing program to produce a lot of houses. It was conceived of as a labor generation program too. And it created thousands of jobs in construction, because construction is a way you can create a lot of jobs, right? They created cement value chains to be able to support industry here to do that. So when they conceived of this public housing project, right, they actually conceived of it as an infrastructure that can create jobs as well. And so I think we have to now expand what our definition is of infrastructure, not just in terms of what the outcome is, but in fact, what's the process of us getting there, and what can that do to help us be able to achieve our just city principles?
Again, thank you, Astrid and David, for your comments. Certainly in agreement that infrastructure development indeed can create jobs, but even more than that is usually a catalyst for wider economic transformation. And Astrid, I like what you just said when we ask about what kinds of cities we're building, what kinds of jobs, they have to be good jobs, right? And one particular area in which our cities can think about the role of infrastructure development in job creation is in the building of green economies. So, or rather green cities for that matter. So that in that sense, we then have an additional challenge that if indeed we are motivated to construct green cities, then we are also motivated to create green jobs. And that would mean that we are then upskilling our workers into earning or rather into learning new skills in the new green economy, as we call it, because I wouldn't think that we are being productive if we just create jobs for the sake of it, but these jobs are actually jobs that undermine the human rights of the workers. They are jobs that contribute to environmental degradation. So it should not just be infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure, but of course, as Astrid has said, sustainability should be at the center of it. Sustainability, including that of the citizens who are getting new skills to be able to live in the economy of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I have to intervene on what Astrid says on Ethiopia. I was in the World Bank when the conversation between the World Bank and the Prime Minister started about Ethiopia social housing. In Ethiopian law, a legacy law, private sector real estate were not allowed. So on World Bank, Ethiopian government presents plan, the World Bank, they say, Mr. Prime Minister, no, this is not good, you're not getting involved. So look, I'm not saying no to private sector. We'll put a new law, we'll allow the private sector, go ahead and build houses for middle class. But I will also build for lower income housing for lower end of community, society. With that sense, not only that, but also the type of engineering, the side roads. So for example, if you look at it, Addis Ababa, Mallas created what you call cobblestones. I don't know if you know cobblestones. Yeah, it said all side, you don't need all the street, the city to be asphalt. It could be cobblestones. That has created, so they created a school, technical school, to design the little stores. They brought German engineers to manage and to look at the quality. I tell you, the relationship between Ethiopian government with the German, the Prime Minister went to Germany, said, how much are you giving me money? They said 300 million euro. He said, keep that money. Can you bring your technology and your engineering, open a school? With that, they opened an engineering school for entry-level laborers. The outcome has been, majority of workers have been women. Very impactful. They're carrying, this in the construction. The biggest impact has been Ethiopia never had a cement factory. Suddenly, the import bill for bringing cement has become $500 million. Suddenly, it allowed Dangote, other companies to open cement. So this is where the, what you call wise design of encouraging labor-intensive construction sector is very important. So with that, let us stop here and open the floor for question and answers. First.
Yeah, my question is more on the legal side. One of the ways I see from the Kenyan experience circumvention of this public participation and access to information is through something called government-to-government deals. It even, I think, disallows us from prioritization. up to date, we have an SGR that ends nowhere. We cannot be given the contract because it was G2G. Is there a legal way to get into that space, or to make it difficult for urban investments to rely on this kind of arrangement?
Like, let's collect a few questions. Next here.
Thank you very much. My question will primarily go to David, but also maybe to anyone to help me understand. When we talk about financing cities, cities are for the people. So I am like, we're financing this for the benefit of the residents. But I think it should go beyond consulting them to involving them in terms of playing a key role in the monitoring, evaluation, and accountability. I want to share 2 statistics from our recent surveys conducted across 39 countries, where when we talk about local governments, only 7% of Africans from those 39 countries feel that their elected councillors listen to them. And only 17% feel that their elected councillors are trustable, that they can trust them. And these are the foundations of what I talked about earlier, of 70% who feel that their governments already have enough money. They don't feel like they should contribute more to whatever they want. And I know, for instance, I know you will concur with this, that, for instance, in Uganda, we have a very elaborate public finance, public infrastructure development, local government laws and practices well in place. But the technocrats have found a way to bend these rules somewhat to exclude the ordinary person, to bend that accountability final leg, and not to function very well. And the result is this public resentment that saying these people are not working for us. To what extent can this be revived? Could we see a new model where, for instance, ordinary people play a more key observatory accountability role than just being consulted? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, the facilitators. It has been very vibrant discussion. I think this is also an area that from us, especially in the UN Habitat, we are trying to see how we are the discussions, especially on municipal financing. But I think it comes out very well like this as we are discussing. And probably, I know David, my friend, and when we talk of the own source revenue, and maybe I will direct this to Astrid on the same line, the issue of the own source revenue, how would we, because I think in the Kenyan situation, and I won't envy you, David, and my friend, when you talk on source revenue in Kenya, it comes in a scenario is, as he's rightfully said, is the service user you pay. And when you bring the service user you pay, is one of the key elements that you look at to improve the own source revenue. But the question is, how do you leverage on the same to spur investments so that you widen those who are able to give more for that? Then the other bit is probably, I would also maybe trying to look at it in connection to what we were discussing early in the morning on the element of recognizing the role of informality and also connected to the own source revenue. And I think somebody asked, I think one of us asked the question, why and who wants a transformation towards formality and for who? And when you look at it this way, it's like the administration wants the formality now to get more access to the source of revenue, because I think the situation we are in Kenya is, if we are not formalized, you don't have a basis of getting that person or that participant. So these are the cities, they are struggling on that bit so much. And probably how would we discuss that, the element of formality vis-a-vis financing the other areas. And then finally, if you look at the infrastructure investments, and we look at the streams of the different resources that are coming, we look to be squeezing the municipal administration, not looking also at the already available financing to the probably the national level is predominantly sourced from those urban or these are the predominant areas. So the question would be, is it an issue of now being just even to the municipality or to the urban area in terms of the resource sharing? Rather than just looking at teaching you that you come up with a mechanism of raising financing for those investments. So we need also to be looking at the data, that how much did we get from these areas and what we need to translate so that we spar more, so that we also see the element of financing, probably also from a just point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give the question number one legal for Jeremy, number two to David, number three on finance to Astrid.
Thank you, Jalal, and Titus, thank you for that question. Is there a legal way to prevent the government from circumventing public participation rules, such as the government-to-government projects? First of all, allow me to say that the longer legal law has limits. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. Yes, that the law has can only help to a certain limit where politics and other forms of power then take on. And it's very difficult, of course, to try to unravel government-to-government transactions that in many instances will be shrouded by claims to, diplomatic immunity, etc. You cannot take them to court for diplomatic relationships. Having said that, where the law ends, we have other institutions that can play a role. And I think even the Kenyans have realized the power of the collective public advocacy. I'll remind us in 2015, 2016, when the government of Kenya listed the Eurobond, which apparently, according to the Auditor General, the proceeds of the Eurobond did not make it back to Kenya. And I think they were earmarked for infrastructure projects. And the Kenyans, knowing the limits to where the law and politics in Kenya could take them, decided to appeal to Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General in the Barack Obama's US government back then, because they recognized that perhaps if we put pressure on the investment banks involved in the issuance of the bond, the US government, which has jurisdiction over the global financial system through various means, might actually come to bear. So Kenyans have tried that form of legal maneuvering. Unfortunately, the US government was not motivated to take that case and help the Kenyans. But it showed that indeed people are trying to find ways of confronting government opacity when the domestic legal system fails. My last comment, though, would be that it's about continuous advocacy efforts that continue to ingrain in public consciousness these just city principles that we've touted here today, and also to impress upon, through advocacy, the citizens the power of the different institutions, cultural institutions, educational, political, and other institutions that can actually play a role in holding government accountable. Because at the end of the day, they come back to us every few years. And so we need to make the just city a norm in everyday people's lives, meaning that people would find it unacceptable to live undignified lives simply because they grew up in the slums. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I will address the one on the participation. My friend here from Kampala, in terms of the involvement. Now, I think what I wanted to bring out is that I fully agree in terms of the issues of public participation. And that's in the Constitution of Kenya. Now, the how is where we get into trouble. because we are getting public participation on how to spend the money and not getting public participation on the planning, because that's where we should start. Yeah, we are making some milestones again at a very experimental level for pushing the city to have a vision 2050. So that whatever is agreed upon in terms of the infrastructure for reaching us to 2050, that should be the ones that will be prioritized over years. Today, the city is doing consultations and project implementations without that plan. And so they get the money and they plan for the money how to spend. We are not sure whether that money is being spent in line with the proposed Vision 2030. So that's the disconnect. Yeah. The starting point should be get the people, let's agree on a plan of action. So that we agree the next 30 years, these are the roads we need, these are the drainage we need, these are the bridges we need. So that every particular year, whether we are going to go to short-term interventions, which is mainly government approach, or maybe 5-year intervention, or long-term, where we bring the PPP for 10, 15 years, there's a clear plan of action. That becomes useful for public participation. But calling them to ask them about prioritization of what? Yeah? They live in home, coming and saying, we need water. Maybe water was not part of the discussion. The next thing you find, the manager drilling a bomb. Okay? Is that a long-term intervention? But already money, public money, has gone to the borehole. So those are the disconnect when we start at economic planning and starting at the spatial planning.
Okay, I know that we're nearly out of time, so I'm going to be very quick, but happy to follow up on any of this. This is, as you can tell, a topic I'm very passionate about. So to Charles's question, you're right. Many of the major cities are where most of the taxes are generated. My own city, Kampala, depending on what data you look at, generates about 40 to 60% of GDP for Uganda, generates somewhere between, again, depending on the data, 50 to 80% of taxes. So the question is, should Kampala get more revenue from the national government? Well, Kampala City, Capital City Authority thinks so. But the duty of the government, as Jeremy mentioned, is not just to the people living in Kampala, it's to the people of the country. And so as that has a redistributive effect, right? Okay, so that's the one thing, right? And I think we forget that sometimes in terms of like, you know, it's a government for the whole people of Uganda and not just for Kampala. And what would happen if we just invested that back in Kampala? Well, guess what? The migration to Kampala would just keep going because it would be the only place you could get decent services. But then what we forget is that the economic prowess of places like Kampala or any other city should actually enable them to raise more own source revenue. So why don't they do this? Well, there's a couple of reasons, but one of them is that many of them are legislatively actually constrained to do it, right? So again, if you want to lobby national government on the fact that you should be able to raise more money yourself, because also guess what? The money you raise yourself, you also tend to be able to spend yourself, right? And on the priorities that you make. Right. So instead of like banging on the door of national government going, give us more money, give us more money, give us more money, bang on the door of national government, say, let us raise more money, let us raise more money, and let us spend it on what we need to spend it on. The final thing we have not mentioned today, but I think is really, really important to your question of public participation. I worked for a really long time very closely with Jennifer Masisi, who used to be the former executive director of Kampala Capital City Authority. I was really embedded in the city structure. And this is, again, not to apologize to technocrats. But where was the majority of Kampala's funding coming from? Not our own government, the World Bank. Who was she accountable to? The World Bank funding cycles. How did that money have to be spent? Well, let's just say it's not on our project priority cycles, right? So that maneuvering that was done, right, was to be able to get money out of the door on someone else's accountability. And so we haven't even mentioned this here, but development partners need to be part of this conversation. And it's a really difficult part of the conversation because they're spending tax money of their constituents. So who are they accountable for? Well, their constituents. But actually, who should they be accountable for? Well, the people that are spending on the ground. And that's the conversation I don't think we have enough, is where those accountability lines lie. Okay.
Thank you, Astrid. Today, this panel discussion was incredibly insightful. The perspective shared by each panelist were both enlightening and thought-provoking. What I appreciate most is the diversity of the opinion of the panelists. First, we have from David, who is the practitioner, the city official. Astrid, international consultant and advisor on subject matter on urbanization. And Jeremy as a professor in the law. And to conclude, I would say, thank you, panelists. Let them give them a round of applause for the